So I am going to talk about social policy, child poverty, and child outcomes in the UK. And very broadly, I'm just going to give you a very quick tour of 25 years of change in social policy. We've seen really big changes in social policy in the UK. So it's very interesting to learn from that about, you know, what works and what doesn't work. So we'll look at the changes and we'll look at the outcomes for children. And then I'll say something about what I think we've learnt about what to do. And I'll try, that's quite a lot of ground. I'll try to be quick. But just to say, first of all, I'm drawing really on two kind of big projects that I've been part of over the years. One is in my research centre case, we have really back since the early 2000s been tracking UK government action on poverties and inequalities. So we've been looking at social policy change, looking at spending and looking at outcomes. And we've got a huge range of publications doing that. So some of what I am talking about comes from that work. And then more recently, I've been part of a mixed methods project looking at some particular reforms to the social security system in the UK, particularly affecting larger families, families with 3 or more children. So I'm also drawing on that. So just to acknowledge my many co-authors and collaborators on those projects. Okay, so we have seen 2 really distinct social policy eras in Britain over 25 years. So we had a Labour government for 13 years, which invested very heavily in children. It invested both in benefits and in services. It had a target to eradicate child poverty, and it backed that up with a programme of financial support for families with children under what we called progressive universalism, which actually has similarities to what Arjuman put up for the Canada tax credit. So a lot of support for those at the bottom and then tapering off as families got richer. Alongside investment in services, and then also some changes in what parents are expected to do. So kind of what was called a rights and responsibilities agenda. So more conditionality, for example, for lone parents. And in answer to, I spoke to Gordon Brown, Sharon, and I asked him your question. And this is what he said when he was Chancellor back in 2001. Is it about money or is it about other things? Well, his answer was, it's about both. And that was very much what the Labour agenda did. It was about both. Since 2010, we've had a really different environment. We've had Conservative-led governments. We've been dominated by austerity policies, initially focused on deficit reduction, continuing onwards. And just as we had investment in both services and in cash benefits for families, we've seen cuts in both, on both sides, alongside the intensification of the kind of expectations on parents. So, for example, requirements on lone parents to work from the age of 3, and in-work requirements also, if you're part-time, requirements to look for full-time work and so on. And that has really held out through 5 Conservative prime ministers over this period. Interestingly, 6 of our 7 recent prime ministers, most recent prime ministers, have been bringing up their own children in number 10 while they were prime minister, which, you know, when Tony Blair did that, it was considered really unusual. He was the first for generations, but this has been the norm. So children have been at the heart of government in one sense through this period, but not necessarily in terms of policy focus. So what that looks like, those kind of 2 eras, you can see here. So that is the total social spending at the top as a share of GDP, rising steadily to 2010 and then being cut. So in kind of real pound terms, in that first period, that averages nearly 5% increase in real spending every year. And in the second period, it averages 0.1% increase every year. So very, very different. And you can see what's being cut. So social protection rose, social protection meaning, you know, social security, cash benefits, include state pensions, rising and then falling. Health, you can see rising as a share of GDP, then it flatlines. Health was relatively protected, although it has not kept up with the rising needs. So it's still very much a crisis situation for health at the moment. And then education, you can see slowly rising as a share of GDP and then slowly being squeezed again. So sadly, we're back now to pretty much where we were 25 years ago in terms of our spending. within some of those categories, you know, the big categories underestimate the extent to which cuts have fallen on children. So this shows us social security spending as an index going back to 2010. And you can see that pensioners, the grey line, they have done okay. Their spending has gone up in real terms year on year. They've been protected by something called a triple lock, which means that every year state pension rises by the highest of wage inflation, price inflation, or 2.5%. So that's a really nice rock solid protection that ensures your pension rises in real terms every year. In contrast, benefits for working age people, including children's benefits, rose by below inflation 1% for a couple of years, and then they were frozen in cash terms for 5 years. Now, uprating is a rather dry topic. People tend to switch off. If you talk about uprating of benefits, it's absolutely crucial, fundamental to the real value of benefits in people's pockets. And more than anything else, this decision is what has driven that drop over time in the amount of spending that's going on children. But there have also been a couple of extra things that have made things worse for some families in particular. Since 2017, you can only claim means-tested benefits for your first 2 children. So that's obviously particularly hit larger families. And we also have a benefit cap. So if no one is working, there's a maximum on the total you can receive. So those have been the focus of my recent project on larger families in particular. Social spending on early childhood services has been squeezed and also become less progressive. I draw your attention there to Sure Start in the middle, which was never a huge package. You know, it's about just over £1 billion being spent at the start of the most recent decade. This was a Labour policy where they rolled out children's centres in each neighbourhood, which combined a whole range of services for families for children under 5 and their parents and carers. So you could go there to play, to do music, to do art, and then also it was a hub for kind of parenting services and more intensive support. So again, it was a kind of progressive universalism type of idea, extremely popular with parents, evaluated to have been effective in terms of changing parenting behaviours and health, but cut over the years. And because I'm running out of time, I won't say much about the early education story, except to say that although that looks good at the end, what's happening there is we are really shifting away. That's really about childcare for working parents. And in terms of the actual levels of per hour support for children, funding is being squeezed. Broadly, what we've seen over this decade is a shift away from a focus on child development and narrowing inequalities using high quality early education towards early children's services being seen much more as childcare for working parents, much less focus on quality and much less focus on the disadvantaged. Here's just a picture of what's happened to Sure Start. You can see it being rolled out, the Sure Start centres, and then gradually cut back over the years. Again, the cuts there underestimate what's really happened because the spending, this shows you the number of centres, the spending for each centre has also fallen sharply. So now let's just look at some outcomes, what's happening. And let's start with poverty. So this is child poverty measured against a relative income measure, 60% of median income. And we always show before and after housing costs because housing costs are to a large extent beyond families' control in Britain. Anyway, it's interesting to look at both, but let's focus on the after housing costs picture. And this is from my larger families project. So we split the data by family size for that reason. And it turns out to be really interesting and something that people hadn't really picked up is that, first of all, poverty fell. You can see the blue line overall for children, you're seeing it fall broadly and then start to rise. But most of that change is happening for larger families. So you can see really dramatic changes if you're a child in a family with where there are 3 children or more. So really kind of converging with the smaller families, and then we see it start to widen. The bump there in around 2004-05, that's the Iraq War. That's what happens when government takes its focus off domestic policy and starts to think about something else. And then Gordon Brown became Prime Minister, and this child poverty agenda was very much his thing. So he sort of renewed policies that were doing that. Then we see from 2010, child poverty starting to rise for those families. This shows us, we'll just look at a couple of other outcomes for children. This shows us the disadvantage gap in assessments of children age 5. Teachers, they have teacher assessed assessments for every child in the country in England at the end of their first year of school, age 5. And this shows us the disadvantage gap in terms of months. So you can see in 2013, it's considered to be about 5.3 months, the gap between children who are eligible for free school meals, so the poorest children and the rest. They changed the way they measure the data, but broadly we see this line falling from about 2006. So it doesn't start falling in 2013, falling to about 2017, and then it starts to flatline for a couple of years. And we didn't really know what was that going to start rising? And it certainly did start rising. Of course, some of that is going to be a COVID effect, some of the rise by 2022. But overall, we see this kind of U-shape. Things were getting better, and now they're getting worse. And we see that U-shape again, inverse here. Here we've got mean birth weight by social class in England and Wales. Very similar picture if I show it by area, levels of area deprivation. But what are we looking at? The purple and the red at the bottom, those are the kind of bottom social classes, people in the most manual labor and long-term unemployed and so on. And you're seeing there across a decade an increase in the mean birth weight. And similarly, you see a reduction in the share of low birth weight, which we know is an indicator of lots of other outcomes for children later on. It's important. We're seeing those gaps narrowing across a decade, and then we start to see them widen again. And this is work that I'm just digging into, really, because I'm really fascinated by this graph. I mean, how is it the case that you change your government and suddenly, you know, birth weight trends start to look different? And it's really, what I wanted to say here actually really echoes what Arjun was talking about, because you can evaluate, or there are evaluations of like tiny pieces of policy which may have contributed to this. So my colleague Mary Reeder has done a very interesting paper where she focuses on a particular policy change in 2009, where Labour introduced a universal grant in pregnancy, quite small. It was universal. And what she finds in her paper, it's quasi-experimental. She's published it in an economics journal because they like that kind of thing. And it's a really nice paper. And she shows that it had a positive effect on birth weight, this little tiny policy. So that's great. And it's really good to show that. But then when you look at this graph, that's a tiny thing of what's happening. Obviously, that's not explaining this whole trend. What is explaining this whole trend? There were so many changes going on, as I've said. You know, we've got reductions in poverty, we've got increase in maternity leave, got investment in health services. So unpicking this seems really important, but exactly as Arjun was saying, you know, we're so pushed towards focusing on tiny pieces of the puzzle. How do we make a causal story which links all of the investments and then all of the cuts to this outcome? So that's something I've been trying to think about and do some work on. Maybe I'll get in touch with Arjun. Finally, on outcomes, this is child obesity by area deprivation. Here it's a less good story for Labour. So certainly if you look at the age 10, 11 children, you can see this is when the data started in 2006-07. You see a deterioration for children living in the most deprived areas, and also for children living in the least deprived areas, but the gap is widening a little bit. But then over the next decade, you see this huge jump, really significant worsening of child's obesity at that age. And this is a trend, by the way. It's not just a COVID effect, although there was a jump in the COVID year. Okay, so this is our Prime Minister standing in the rain last week, dissolving. All my husband could focus on was how is he ruining such a good suit by standing in the rain. Yeah, and to make it even better, at the end of the road, you know, Downing Street is a street and there's some gates at the end, and at the end someone was playing very loudly on a loudspeaker a song, Things Can Only Get Better, which was the sort of anthem of the Labour government in 1997. And so he had to speak against the backdrop of this sound. So here he is. Hopefully things may be about to change for us. Huge to-do list for an incoming government, and I won't go through all of that, but again, of course, we need both. We need public services, we need investment in benefits and action on child poverty. I'm going to focus on this side because I think that although we need to do all of these things, I think the significant thing about child poverty is that we really have, government has this big lever that it can pull if it wants to, and it can make a huge difference to this very, very, very quickly. And that is one reason we need to keep banging on about it. So I'm going to focus a little bit on this and about what we know about what to do about this in the last 5 minutes of my time. And essentially, I think what we learned from the Labour years, or at least what Labour did, and it was pretty effective, was that they invested in social security benefits for children. So what we're seeing on this figure is the percentage point difference in relative poverty rates made by the tax and transfer system. So you have your pre-tax and transfer poverty rate, and then you have the action of taxes and transfers. How much difference does that make? So you can see in the mid-90s, we've got 3 groups here. Sorry, it's a bit small, the print, but we've got adults who are working age with no children in blue. Then we've got children living in smaller families and children in larger families. And you can see that the system was making about 10 percentage points difference to poverty at the start for all groups. And then what happens with the investments that are made is that we see a huge increase in the effectiveness of the system for families with children, particularly for larger families. And then we see that start to be eroded from around 2012-13 when the cuts start to come in. So if I show you that figure, which is the poverty rate, you can see, okay, now we see how they did it. They increased the effectiveness of the system, and it maps on pretty exactly onto the poverty rates. That's what was going on. Yesterday, we saw from Amelie, we saw Canada's decrease in poverty and the links there to employment. And that's obviously the big question, but that's how we tend to, certainly, you know, we often think that it's about work, it's about parental work. If we want to tackle child poverty, that's what we do. Well, in the UK, we did see parental employment rise. We saw it rise by quite a lot over the years. So we went from about 45% lone parent rate employment, for example, to more like something in the 70s. We also have far more families where two-parent families where both are working, including working full-time. But what we did in our paper, and it's probably badly labeled, but we kind of tried to decompose, well, how much of the change, how much of the reduction in poverty, the good years, that's what you've got on the left set of bars, and then the increase, the bad years on the right, how much of that is explained by changes in employment, and how much of it is explained by social security, essentially, the risks within employment groups. And what you can see, so composition, the orange bars, tells us how much of the change in poverty is driven, what change in poverty is driven by people, a change in composition of employment. So people moving from low risk, high risk categories like no employment into work. And you can see that that is putting downward pressure on the poverty rate. It is making some difference, but it's very, very small. It's just 1 or 2 percentage points. Where the action is in changes in the risk of poverty for families within employment categories. So the risk of poverty if you are not employed, for example. And that is where all of the effect is coming from in the Labour years, the reductions in risk within categories, and a huge increase in those risks within categories in the later years, which is kind of swamping that employment effect. So in our case, this is all about redistribution, essentially. Very little of it is about employment. I think I'm going to, well, why is that? Why is employment not doing more lifting is a very important and interesting question that I don't have time to expand on too much, but there's a few different factors. One is, of course, there are differences in household working hours. So being in work itself, you know, there's a huge range there. There's also inequalities in wages. So again, there's a huge range there. And then, which we touched on yesterday in Amelie's talk, the fact that this is a relative poverty line, remember? So if you've got more and more families in which 2 parents are working, the poverty line is going up and up and up all the time. So what you can see here is this is the poverty rates before any taxes and transfers. So obviously, if you are not in work, that's almost 100% over time, much lower if you are working part-time or self-employed, lower still if you're full-time. But within these categories, we see the rise, the risk rising over time. So we've got people moving from this category to this category, for this category, but there's a rise in poverty within those groups. So there's a kind of paradox here, right? If you are an individual family, getting someone in your household into work or working more hours is a really good idea, good solution. It's going to decrease your risk of poverty, no question. But at a societal level, having more and more parents work and work and work does not remove the need for redistribution. In fact, what these kind of overall lines showing us is that it actually increases the need for redistribution. Probably partly because you are always going to be leaving some people behind, and you need to help them reach the line. So lots of reasons to focus on employment. It's not a substitute for redistribution. Redistribution is where the action is. And just to kind of ram home that point, these are poverty rates by work status. And this really shows us something which I don't publicize too much because I'm not sure it would be a popular story, but what Labour did, how Labour got poverty down was, aiming to boost parental employment, yes, and they did some of that, but what they did is actually get money to families where no one was working. This is the no working line, huge differences, and then it starts to rise again. Okay, so just to summarize, it's been a really tough decade for children in the UK. They've experienced more than any other demographic group. They've had cuts to their family benefits, and they've had cuts to services. And that shows up in sharp increases in child poverty. We also see these increasing inequalities in health and developmental measures, which seem very likely to be linked. And it's not always possible to create these causal stories, but it certainly seems, pinning that down and battling with the problem that Arjuman set out, I think is really, really important to try and make the case that these things are related. Lots to do for a new government, and alongside service investments, I've argued that tackling child poverty should be high on the agenda. And we know that government has very powerful levers, which is actually very easy for them to pull if they choose to do so. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kitty, for a really in detail examination of how many, 20, 30 years of
25
of social policy, which for those of us from the UK and those of us concerned about child poverty has been a real roller coaster. Because actually prior to, you focused on Labour under Gordon Brown and Blair, but of course prior to that, it was almost impossible to discuss poverty because we weren't allowed to use the terms. We had to talk about something other than inequalities. You weren't allowed to talk about that. It was diversity or something of that sort. So from my personal point of view, because throughout that period, I've been focusing on the issue of child poverty and its relationship to health. This work from Kitty's group is really powerful. Questions?
Yes. Please name yourself for people who are online.
Heinraad, Erasmus Medical Center, Netherlands. Thank you very much for this impressive overview. I have two questions. One is, first we see the left-wing government doing well on the outcomes, and then the right-wing government doing less good. But would it be in history that over the years the policies get better, and only the increase is slower during right-wing government? Or is it really left-wing government good, right-wing government not good? And one question intriguing me, when the not rich people are the majority of the people, how come that in elections that for so many years such right-wing government gets the power?
Excellent question. So, so the first question, I suppose you mean if we looked at if we looked at centuries, I guess we would see a lot of these things improving. right, over time, including we've extended nursery education now to all 3 and 4 year olds. So presumably now, compared to if I had a timeline going back 50 years, we would see things a lot better than they were, and that's also true with the health indicators for sure. So I guess if we step back, we see, but you know, you have these dips in progress, and this is very clearly one of those dips. You also see, and I felt I had too much material, so I didn't put it in, but with it, you know, the poverty rate is obviously a very kind of one high level measure. One thing we're really seeing in recent years is real levels of destitution for much smaller number of families, which are really, you know, take us back, I would say, pre-welfare state. So the kind of removal of supports, for example, the benefit cap, which very deliberately ensures that families, it works out what a family needs, and then it says, no, we're going to give you, you know, we're going to give you less. And the amounts of money some families are living on. We've done qualitative work as part of our project with larger families as well as quantitative, and it is really shocking and eye-opening. So in some ways, you know, some parts of progress are like that's throwing us back, not just a decade, but kind of 5 or 6 decades. The other question, I mean, that's, yeah, I really puzzle. I sometimes think about when people first got the vote, you know, when the working man got the vote in the 1870s in Britain, would they possibly...
Working man.
It was the working man in the 1870s, but I mean, even then, yeah. So working class men got the vote. Would they have imagined that 150, you'd think that would be it, yeah? The rich would have had their day. And that's not, it's not how it is. And I guess who controls the messages and who controls the media, and something Kate Pickett yesterday talked about the importance of how inequalities can lead to the domination of some groups. They're able to lobby government. We know that, you know, we know huge amounts of money are going into the Conservative Party. We know who owns the newspapers. So yeah, I mean, I'm not a political scientist, but that's, as I observe it, those are the factors.
Okay, Lynn Kemp from Sydney, Australia. I'm just wondering, can we unpick a little bit the health grant, the expenditure on health being protected? Because of course the biggest providers of health for young children in England and the UK are health visitors who got removed from the health workforce and put into local authority. So if health has been, and cut, so if health has been protected, then that budget is reflective of actually a negative sort of increase in the uncapped spending on emergency presentations and those sorts of things, because the preventive services that got taken out of the NHS moved into local authority and absolutely decimated. So I'm just wondering, have you kind of unpicked that in thinking about, because I would argue, as a health visitor, I would argue health is not being protected from children's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I said relatively protected. So yeah, I wouldn't want to imply that we did try to unpick. It's very difficult. I think that particular point's a really important one. We don't have good data on how health spending is spent. You know, we wanted to see how much. It would be great to be able to say the over 80s are being protected and what's actually happening to the parts. We did do some work trying to dig into that. We didn't get very far. Maybe we should pick that up again. But even beyond that, you know, if you look at the whole, when I say relatively protected, it's kind of staying the same or rising very slightly in real terms. But we know that the demand, the aging population, rising poverty, both of those things place huge additional demands on the health services. So actually need, if you look at, we do have estimates of need, and it's lagging way behind need. And the other thing is that we have no social care policy to speak of. And that's been a huge failure of all of these governments to tackle that. And that means that health services also kind of dealing with long-term care in a way, like they often have people stuck in hospital for weeks and weeks because they've got no one to care for them. Yeah, so it's relative to other areas, but it's certainly, I mean, it's probably going to be top of the list for an incoming government to get some funds into the health service straight away.